First up is Cecilia Dean, who started publishing Visionaire, a limited edition publication that she co-founded back in 1991. Together with two friends, she decided to start a magazine, a vehicle for creative people who had nowhere to publish more experimental personal work, especially within art and fashion image making. Since, Visionaire has collaborated with an extensive list of artists and brands, conceptualizing and producing content, experiences, and art, within and beyond, morphing and redefining the publication format. Welcome, Cecilia. It's great to have you with us from New York.
Hi, Elise. Thanks for having me.
So the magazine is a major part of the fashion world, perhaps even more before, but I'd still like to believe that magazines have a certain defining power in setting agendas, forming opinions, and giving directions, and embody a highly interesting and important role in fashion's production and mediation. At the same time, the idea of the publisher is not as much as a spectacle or as sensationalized in fashion as that of the designer, the photographer, or the creative director. So I want to start off by asking you, Cecilia, what does it mean to be a publisher today?
Well, I think to be a publisher today also depends on how you define that term. I think the more traditional definition of publisher within the magazine industry, is more like, the person who has the magazine, it's like kind of an older person. It's usually a little bit more commercial minded. And I think today, because we have so many tools, everyone to a certain extent can be a publisher. My definition of publisher is taking images, from whoever, from creative people, and being able to share it with a larger audience. How you do that is, to me, is completely, up for grabs. The traditional definition of publisher, to me, is very much rooted in printed matter, in ink on paper, in bindings, magazines, in the very traditional sense, and books. And I think now, that we're in this digital world, publishing images, sharing them with a larger audience can take on a myriad of different formats. So I think that's a complicated question, like what is a publisher?
So Cecilia, from your very extensive experience, how do you understand fashion media to have evolved over time?
Well, I don't think fashion media has evolved very much over time. And I think we are in a place right now where it needs to make some decisions. I mean, I think we can all see from, the business aspect, traditional printed magazines they're all struggling. Advertisers are dropping off, but we're in a weird transition because everyone knows they have to pay more attention to digital, but they're not putting the budgets towards digital. There is still this sort of nostalgia for printed magazines, which part of me I kind of understand, but it's just wasteful at this point. And I am very concerned with the environment. And I think the way that the publishing industry is set up is incredibly wasteful and needs to change. And I think the fashion media has to evolve. I think social media has been really powerful. And, obviously there's a ton of content, but it's just so much content. So we need curators. And that's really, I think, where magazines flourished. It was a point of view. It was the editor-in-chief and the creative director and the whole team deciding what they liked, what they wanted to push, who they wanted to support creatively. And you would buy the magazines, depending on what tribe you belong to. The woman buying Cosmopolitan is probably not the same person who was buying The Face. And that was, that sort of like was also like with radio stations, like back in the 80s, your tribe listened to certain radio stations and certain music. But, with the internet and social media, it's like everything is out there. And I feel like those tribes aren't quite as delineated. And I think that's gonna happen, right? It's always like that, always starts with like sort of chaos and just an onslaught of like stuff. And then, you find people that resonate with you, and then you sort of follow what they have to say. And it's hard. I mean, I think we're in a really difficult and weird and exciting stage of fashion media.
I agree. And I believe a big part of your signature as a publisher is that there's always a big emphasis on the format and the medium you choose to publish within. Can you talk a little bit more about your relationship between form and content?
I think when we start working on an issue of Visionaire, it usually starts with the theme, and then the theme will instruct what the format is and what the overall design direction is. So it's really all about what that idea that we're pursuing is that trickles down to everything else. And then that really determines production, that determines, how much budget we need, that determines how many editions we make, and then that determines the retail price. I mean, it's all interconnected, it's nothing is arbitrary. Usually we start with a theme, so it's really like a subject matter that we personally want to explore. And then sometimes we have started with a format, knowing that, this is a physical object that we want to create. So working backwards, what theme would embody this object? And then that determines which artists do we want to contact to see if they would be interested in participating. That's all. It's a very linear, it's always like such a shit show, but it is a linear process.
I thought that answer was beautiful. So there's one particular mutual dependency between the fashion industry and fashion publishing that I'd like to highlight, which is advertising, ads or advertorials. You mentioned a little bit, but talk us through your approach to advertising with Visionaire. How do you sustain the magazine artistically and financially?
From the very beginning, we said we would never take advertising. We were not interested in selling pages to companies to run their advertisements that you could see every place else. It made no sense to us. And we were also very aware that, when a company gives you money, you have to answer to them to a certain degree. And it was absolutely imperative that we answered to no one except ourselves. Especially since we were offering a platform for these creative people to be experimental or to publish more personal work. So, anyone else's opinion about that could not survive in that environment. Which is why, editions are expensive. Because we pay for editions through sales. And then later on, we started working with companies as sponsors. And a sponsor is very different than an advertiser because we are working with these companies in a much more collaborative effort. So it's not like they're paying money and they're given like a page or oh, you get to put your logo on the case or something. It's much more of an intense relationship where we're taking inspiration from that company. But it is very important that we still remain creatively free. And we always make that that's actually part of our contract with any sponsor, is that Visionaire has final editorial say on everything. And I'd say many times the sponsor doesn't even see any of the content until they get the finished product. And I think the whole sponsorship route started because these large companies, our first one was Louis Vuitton, for instance, and these large companies saw an opportunity to express themselves a little bit differently. So it wasn't as simple as buying a page for an advertisement. It was exercising maybe a larger message or communicating a larger message on behalf of their company. And then we worked with quite a few companies, in collaboration with a guest editor, right? So Riccardo Tisci was a guest editor, and while he was at Givenchy, and then Givenchy was the sponsor. And we did the same with Eddie Slimane and Dior Homme, Ray Kawakubo and Comme des Garçons. And these particular editions are so fascinating for me to work on because we actually adopt someone else's aesthetic. I love Riccardo Tisci's edition. It's called Religion. It's not an edition we would ever have done on our own, but because Riccardo was our guest editor, we adopted his vision and his aesthetics and the people he wanted to work with. And I think what it gave to Givenchy was a tool for Riccardo, but I should just be more general. I think what it gives to the corporate sponsor, they're artists unto themselves. The final product happens to be apparel, but they are so in touch with, in tune with referencing like art and public art and current events and everything that's in the world around us. And even writers who aren't visual. And it's important to be able to show that a fashion designer on behalf of their brand is not just the apparel, it's actually an entire lifestyle. It's an entire aesthetic, and it's an entire tribe. And I think that it's exactly how we started Visionaire, like on steroids. Right. So before it was like a little bit more modest, and now it's like with these corporate sponsors, we could do like really big productions, and it's run on batteries, or it's in this giant wood case, or all sorts of crazy stuff we've done, which we're able to do because we have the financial support of a corporate sponsor. But also we have like this creative freedom and aesthetic freedom.
And that leads me on to my next question. The Visionaire issues have always had a very particular curation of people, whether it be, you mentioned the Louis Vuitton fashion special issue with, one main brand, or the chic Mario Testino publication where photographer Mario Testino guest edited the issue kind of solo. Or the beauty issue that was more of a juxtaposition of multiple practitioners working with one specific thematic. How important are your contributors for you and the publication's voice?
I would say that the publication is the vehicle for our contributors to have a voice. So, I was talking earlier about having guest curators, and that's really fun and thrilling because it sort of opens up new doors for us. But most of the time, we're actually the editors, and so we decide what the theme is and the format, and we make all the decisions, and then we invite artists we think that will enjoy the theme, or that will push them maybe to think a little bit differently, or it's a challenge, or we know that a certain artist is interested and exploring a certain subject matter, and we want to give them the opportunity to do that. And we are, of course, about creative expression, but at the end of the day, we're also editors, and so we decide what we publish and what we don't publish. And for me, I can look at an image and say like, oh, well, that's Visionaire, or oh, that's not Visionaire. And that's not personal. Like there's a ton of work that I love, but I know, you know what, that's not really going to resonate in an issue of Visionaire. I just think we have honed a certain aesthetic or a certain eye. And so all the issues really that aren't with guest curators are very much coming from us personally. Visionaire is totally subjective. Like I have never told anyone like this, what we say is the truth. Like to me, there's no truth in fashion. This is my personal truth. This is what I like. I hope you like it too, or discuss it. But Visionaire is a highly subjective endeavor.
So I think fashion journalism has been in a poor state for a while and is still far from ideal. The written word is oftentimes deprioritized in favor of visual content, and in-depth, text stories are branded and low-key based on commercial interests. Visionaire is just about text-free. How important do you feel that the written word and, a sharp pen in fashion publishing is today? And does, for you, does the visual content trump text content?
I don't think you can compare text and words. It's just how they're different forms of communication. Personally, I'm not a text-heavy person. I'm not a great writer. I love to read, but I'm not a good writer myself, and I know that. And we were all, I'm talking about the founders, but me and James, we were coming from the fashion industry, and fashion is visual, right? So that is our DNA. I also like the idea that visuals, cross boundaries. Like nothing has to be translated. It's like everyone can have a reaction to an image, whether it's like, I love it, I hate it, or I don't know what's going on. You can have a reaction, which is very different from text. If you look at a page of text and it's not your language, you can't have any reaction to it. And that's not to put down text. That's just to say that that's just not where our head is at. Ironically, I did do my major in French and English literature. So, I mean, who knows? It's just, that's what interested me, but never as a writer. Although I really wish I could write.
But there's also an exception to that statement about Visionaire being text-free. I remember the fashion reports that Bill Cunningham did for some of the first Visionaire issues, and I don't think people really know about his journalism. His fashion knowledge was insane. And perhaps it was something about that photographer-writer composition that made it perhaps more appealing. It was like he translated his sharp, eye for photography into his writer, into his pen. And I mean, some of these reports were also layouted, and writing felt more descriptive and almost like visual text somehow. How did that collaboration come about? What was it like working with Bill, the journalist?
Bill Cunningham was amazing, and he did our fashion reports for the first few years of Visionaire. That came about because he used to do a huge fashion report for a magazine called Details. And at a certain point, Details was bought by Condé Nast, and so they decided not to do Bill Cunningham's fashion report. I mean, he literally did 200 pages. It was insane, of all the fashion shows all over the world. And so he lost that vehicle, and so we said, we'll be that vehicle for you. And You know, you bring up a good point about his text. Fashion text is, to me, purely subjective, but what Bill Cunningham brought to it was the whole historical aspect. He could show you and teach you the references that all these designers were referencing. He taught you like the history and how a garment evolved over 100 years and what we were looking at now. And it's true, he was an encyclopedia of fashion knowledge. And working with him was definitely an experience. He, you know, knew exactly what he wanted to say and how the layout should look. So I would go to sleep at night with a paper and pen next to my bed because I knew that Bill was going to call me at like 6 a.m. because that's when he got up, and he would have a ton of notes, and I'd sit there and take notes over the phone. You know, because obviously there was no email back then, and this, whatever, it was a different time. So yes, I slept with the phone next to my head and a piece of paper and a pencil so that I could like take all of his notes. And then we would just, you know, do what he wanted and publish it. And it was really, it was such an honor and privilege for us to be able to run those reports. At a certain point, after a few years, we stopped doing it because we were on a more strict schedule when we first started, and then we really started doing only like 2 or 3 issues a year. And it didn't always fall with the fashion shows. So it became too difficult timing-wise to continue the reports with him. But we remained very, very close with him until his passing.
So, you know, advertising is one thing, but fashion people's, you know, entire lifestyles and economies today are so highly dependent on, you know, product placements, you know, attending these dinners, being flown into fashion shows, accommodated, you know. How do you navigate this, you know, personally, but also as a fashion publisher today?
Well, one of the positives of this pandemic, and don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing positive about it, but it has offered us a moment to step back and not be on what I call the hamster wheel. And it will be very telling to see, once we're out of this, who gets back on that hamster wheel. You know, I think in the beginning, fashion is inherently a social industry. It's all about community, being together, sharing experiences, being at events. You know, it's highly, highly social. You know, so the fact that we can't be social is weird. It's just weird for this industry, and the industry does not know how to deal with it. It's, you know, we just finished New York Fashion Week. People are struggling to figure out how to show their collections in a time when we can't be together. But getting back to your question, you know, I think in the beginning it's really fun to do all these dinners and shows, but after a while it's tiring, and I feel like I don't want to be tired from going to parties and dinners. That's such a weird, privileged thing to say. Like, I want to be tired because like I'm working really hard on something, or I've had to like meet a deadline, or I don't know, or have to feed the chickens, or whatever, just like a lot of other things to be tired of. I don't want to be tired of like going to a fashion show, because at the end of the day, they're amazing public art events.
Cecilia, lastly and more broadly, what changes would you like to see in the fashion industry at large?
I really don't know where fashion needs to go. I love fashion. I love dressing. I think it's such a powerful tool for everyone. You know, I love the exclusivity of it, but I also think that that's a bad thing. I love the idea of the democratization of fashion, but I'm very against fast fashion and disposable fashion. I believe in saving up money to buy a piece that you will wear and treasure for the next 20 years. I'd say most of my wardrobe are pieces that I have worn hundreds of times. So it's hard. I feel like it's difficult, you know. I think fashion needs to be much more aware of the environment, and it needs to evolve without sacrificing the design and the aesthetics. You know, I always feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect between sustainable fashion and fashion. Like fashion should just be fashion, and behind the scenes is sustainable. But you know, fashion is what, the second largest polluter on the planet. I mean, it's just horrifying. I think the seasons makes no sense, especially, you know, we're in a climate crisis. Like, we don't need to change our wardrobes every 6 months. I think the fashion show cycle that designers were on, where they were doing up to 10 collections a year, is completely unsustainable emotionally and mentally. I think that Fashion Week, as much it was wonderful for people to get together, was incredibly costly in terms of like hundreds, thousands of people like flying all around the world. I don't know, there's just like a lot of things that need fixing, and I think the pandemic has just sort of highlighted all of that and has put more pressure on everyone to figure it out fast. So I don't have an answer for you. I'm as curious as everyone else is to know how the fashion industry is going to survive this. But I do know that fashion is very important for our culture and for people as individuals, and it will always exist. We just have to figure out how to make it exist in an environmentally safe way.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Cecilia, and for this conversation. It was a true pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Elise. I hope you edit it nicely and make me sound smoother.